For those of you who enjoyed today's call and want to invest more into your organization or initiative's approach to community engagement, the Tamarack Institute will actually be bringing Max to Canada to give a series of new one-day workshops in Halifax, Ottawa, Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver. These workshops are designed to help you bring new and innovative tools and methods for meaningfully engaging communities and citizens back to your organizations. We'll have a bit more information about this workshop later.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Rethinking Democracy, Strategies that Put Citizens at the Center. As Duncan had said, my name is Silvia Chu, and I'm a Consulting Director for Collective Impact with the Tamarack Learning Center. And today, I'm here to introduce our discussion with Max Hardy of Max Hardy Consulting in Australia. For those of you who haven't yet had the privilege of meeting Max, he brings more than 20 years of experience facilitating collaborative processes such as citizen juries that place the citizen perspective at the center of an array of complex issues, including health policy changes, land use planning, and community master plans throughout Australia and beyond. His methodologies for bringing together advocates and allies, corporations and citizens have generated powerful community-owned solutions to some of the toughest issues being faced by communities. Welcome, Max. I understand it's pretty early in the morning for you, but we're so glad you could take time out to chat with all of us this afternoon.
Well, I'm thrilled to join you.
I'm glad you're here. To kind of kick us off, maybe, how about you tell us a little bit about how you came to get started in the work of community engagement?
Sure. Well, it started really when I was a public servant, and I was planning services, I guess, to meet a range of needs, including services for people who were homeless, and we had this requirement, which I didn't really know about, which was engage the community to find out how we might go about identifying needs and how we might provide services better than what we were. So this was going back a long time now, in the early 1990s. And then I was sort of ready for a change, and I found that there was a position is a company called Twyford's, and they're advertising for community engagement consultants. And I thought, well, I'm doing a lot of this work, and yeah, I think I'll throw my hat in the ring for that. And it was successful. And what I was what I found myself doing was doing a lot of community engagement, not so much around social issues, but environmental issues, and around wastewater and planning for trying to address a whole number of things: water supply, wastewater management. Then it moved into urban planning. So it's kind of out of my comfort zone in a way in terms of the content, but the process was all kind of similar. It was, it was checking in with people, and it was finding out what mattered to people, and making sure that citizen voice and community involvement was actually meaningful, was influencing decisions. So I was doing that for quite some time, and then started experimenting and with different processes and reading about different ways of doing things. And so I guess for the last 20 years, I've been adapting, experimenting, stealing other people's ideas, and finding new ways of doing things depending on what the context was. So it's probably a long answer, but I think that I found that it started. I guess I started doing work that was probably fairly conventional in terms of doing community consultation, but have been kind of pushing boundaries and trying different things ever since.
I love that, the blend for you, starting very traditionally, but then over time, not being afraid to kind of experiment and kind of mishmash up with other people's ideas. It's interesting, as I listened to you talking about the kinds of work that you were doing at the time, things like, land use planning or, water management stuff. Those can be very, very contentious issues, yeah?
Yeah, they sure can, and often starting at a point where there is a community that is quite outraged about an issue or a proposal.
And so that's I think, something that's quite, talk about jumping in with both feet is part of what's going on in my head at the moment. But I wonder, from that and having stood in engagement processes where there are factions that are quite polarized, what would you say are some of the most significant insights or learnings that you have around what it takes to put citizens at the center and why that's particularly important in the work that you do?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I could tackle it in different ways. I'm trying to get to the heart, I guess, of what are the most significant insights. One has been that the most difficult challenge, I believe, is working often with organisations that engage me to do this work. So often it's a government department or an authority that's sort of, responsible for water or electricity or planning, and working with them to be more open to the value that citizens bring. So what I initially found is that I was doing a lot of work with communities, and there was plenty of energy for people to get involved. And engaging those communities is not difficult. If people are outraged or they're upset or they're involved, then working with that it's not difficult to get people involved, which is kind of different to some situations where it seems really hard to get people engaged. So when an issue is controversial, there's already energy in the community to tap into. So I find there that there are challenges certainly in starting to invite people to move from outrage to then being participants in designing a process and coming up with options and solutions. But there's also work involved with organisations to not see the communities as a problem to be solved and people to manage, rather than seeing them as an asset that they can work with to find ways of working through those challenges. So one of my insights, I guess, I've found is that helping organisations to change the narrative and also their own discourse about how they refer to communities, not so much as, well, this is really difficult and this is, a problem we have to manage. We need to manage our stakeholders, rather than how do we actually tap into energy, insights, experience, passion, and invite people to work with that in a much more constructive way, and to expect that people can actually move to a different mode, which is, let's see what we can figure out together.
That's very helpful. It's interesting that, when the passion is there from a community perspective, you're saying it's not difficult to get people in the room. But is it difficult for, do you find that even when you bring citizens into the room, they may not speak with a common voice? There may be different polarizing positions, and that can be part of the work about helping people to see the value in a perspective that's different from their own.
Oh, certainly.
Insights
And
about how to do that well?
yeah,
Or what not to do even?
Well, I think it even another question to answer is that you might have people in the room that have polarized position, but there are also people, even when a community is activated or enraged, there are people who are not in the room. There are still there are people who are quite passive, or who are still disengaged. So part of the process we have found very powerful is inviting people into processes who would otherwise not participate, who find it too unpleasant and uncomfortable, and using methods like random selection to invite people, and incentivizing people who would normally not participate to come into the process and to have a look at what's going on and to see what their perspective is, and for those people to weigh up what they're hearing from various experts or people who have very strong polarized views, and for them to be involved in making sense of it. And so they come in with kind of a fresh perspective, and in that regard, often we don't see children or young people getting involved, but sometimes, or invariably, their involvement, that they come into an issue, and when they're seen as an asset, and we say, we need your help to come in and work this out, because guess what, the adults aren't figuring this out very well. and they come with a totally new view about, and a longer term view about an issue, and saying, well, we find that there are groups who are quite entrenched, people maybe aged, certainly above 50, who are slugging it out, and they're talking about long-term planning, and we don't have young people involved in the conversation, and they seem to have a way of confronting, in a way, and cutting through a lot of those polarized positions, because they're not engaged with those different camps. They're not sort of, they haven't sort of signed up to a tribe that has a particular point of view. They're coming in and asking fresh questions, and also often with an openness to information that people are feeling very skeptical about, that they say, well, we're learning about all this stuff, and you're having this fight about all this, and we're really concerned about the way this is going to play out in 20 or 30 years. So, it's just very interesting, I think, that the voices that aren't in the room, and about how we can actually make space for that.
Well, I'm wondering if maybe it might be helpful to get you to maybe share an example or two about how you have done this work across Australia, because I'm seeing questions coming in, which I'm appreciating. Thank you, folks. Some is, how do we engage those who don't typically engage? How do we overcome people's initial reluctance with all the other things that are competing for their attention?
Yes, certainly.
Those are big questions. And also, how do you make sure that the work that you are doing results in solutions that the community really feels a sense of ownership to?
Yeah. And I'm seeing some of those questions too, and they're great questions. And I find it's really hard to give a very simple answer to the difficult questions, because we're dealing with complexity, and I don't believe there's any easy formula to say nail it by just doing this, because the dynamics are quite different. So let me just maybe share a few examples of some things that have happened, and I'm by no means saying that here is the formula for all of them, because I think it's about, we need to be very curious and open that what has worked elsewhere may not work in this context. But I think the principles are approaching these issues with some curiosity, but with the belief that if we create the right sort of container, or the right sort of boundaries for a process, and we invite people into it, believing that people are capable of rising to the occasion, of being able to look at things differently, and to wrestle with and appreciate the complexity, that they can actually work through that. So it is very challenging when there are different power dynamics, certainly. And, the work involved in having people with power to actually recognize that their solution or their stance isn't the only way that things can be done or seen, and then being receptive. There's a lot of work in that, and there's huge amount of research, PhDs, around how you actually get people with power to actually look at how they can use that power differently. So there's a lot of work in that. So let me just talk about a few examples.
But I do like your caution before you give us your examples about, this is not about a recipe. This is about getting an inspiration, being really clear about what principles really apply, and being inspired by that and guided by that. So take us away. Can you share some examples?
Okay, I'll try and do these fairly briefly, because I know we're going to provide links for people to read more about these processes, and there are some video clips there that we can look at. We will look at one in a moment, but there are others that people can look at. The first, I wanted to talk about something that happened 10 years ago. It was a citizens' parliament, and this was not something that government was actually necessarily wasn't sponsoring. It was actually a research exercise that was actually prompted by politicians who'd moved out of politics, saying, you know what, the system we think is actually not is frail, it's a bit broken, and we need different ways of citizens to be involved in how we engage and how we work through things, how we can actually strengthen our democracy. And so the Citizens' Parliament was sponsored by a group called New Democracy, and they had a a very significant philanthropist, and they also attracted some funding from the Australian Research Council. So this was more like an experiment, and the experiment was all about, if we have a bunch of citizens from all across Australia and we randomly selected a citizen from every electorate in Australia, so we had 150 people brought together, and the question was, well, how can we actually strengthen our democracy? How can Australia's political system be strengthened to serve us better? And we drew inspiration from a Canadian example in British Columbia, which was the Citizens' Assembly, which was looking at a very similar question. What was interesting about this process is that we then had politicians, we had activists and others presenting their views about what was wrong with our democracy, but also what they thought was strong about it and how we could actually reinvent it and do things differently. And so over a period of a few days, there was quite a lot of insights, and what happened to people in that process was quite fascinating. And if people have a look at the video, you find a young woman, the youngest woman who was in the out of the 150, who said the process so impacted on her, and she found that the whole thing so interesting about what makes a democracy meaningful, that she said, I want to actually get involved in this space, and I want to become the first female prime minister in this country as a result of just being, awakened to what's at stake and what's frail and not working. Of course, it's too late for her to be our first female prime minister. So that happened several years later with Julia Gillard. But I think what's interesting is what happens to people when they're involved in a process and they're invited to help grapple with something really challenging. So that was kind of a really interesting process. But what was also interesting is, because it was an experiment, that recommendations were made in this report that was handed to government as a gift, and government accepted it. But because they hadn't actively sponsored it, they kind of really weren't sure what to do with it. And in some ways, some of the recommendations were quite challenging for government to hear. And so they said, thanks very much for the work. We'll need to think about this. And then, probably things went just back to normal. So there wasn't an active sponsorship, but we knew there wasn't. But what we're trying to do is demonstrate that citizens are able to get their heads around complexity, can think through things that are very challenging, and they can work together to come up with solutions. And they can do that by bouncing off people who are very resourceful, who are specialists, I guess, in this area. But they're able to work together to arrive at some powerful recommendations. So I think this was kind of again, part of when I talked about the insight earlier, it's about how people, when we create the right conditions, are able to step into a journey where they're learning stuff, they're curious, and they're on a journey, and they're able to land at some really wise recommendations, and the process itself has an impact on people. So this was something I thought, well, I need to keep carrying this, because actually I totally believe this now, and I never cease to be surprised about how people do rise to the occasion. So this was kind of, in a way, it was a bit like the way it was designed was like a really big citizens jury, but it was with 150 people, and they were sort of grappling with this challenge. So that was one example, and that was 10 years ago now that I was involved in that process, which was quite fascinating. So I do encourage people to have a look at the video to get a feel for that. The next example I want to talk about was something that happened then about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, which was a thing called the Queensland Plan. And the Premier at the time in Queensland, a state in Australia, said that a lot of local governments are doing a great job at future planning for cities. And he said, I want to try and do that for the whole state of Queensland. And so the question that we were wrestling with initially was, well, how do you get a whole state involved in planning the future of a state? And with colleagues, I was working with Twyfords at the time. We had developed a pathway for collaboration, which basically pointed to the importance of not just engaging people about coming up with solutions, but engaging people in how we design a process that will work for people. And so somehow we persuaded the Parliament of Queensland to invite 400 people together, which was every state member of Parliament, and they were invited to invite 3 or 4 of their people in their electorates, but they couldn't be their mates. They had to be people who were different, and could even be people that they would disagree with. They weren't necessarily leaders, but people who were in the community that they thought kind of loosely represented a bit of a microcosm of their electorate, which is very hard with just a handful of people. But if you aggregate that by 80 MPs, we end up with a few hundred people, and it was a very interesting mix of people. But what was challenging about this is we weren't saying what should the vision for Queensland be, what should we be focusing on. We said we want you to actually design or design the process. We want you to actually confirm what are the questions that you think Queenslanders should be exploring. And this was kind of really unusual, but in the end, the parliamentarians supported this process, because we said what invariably happens is that government decides what are the questions, or government departments or authorities say, we're framing the question and we're inviting you to come and try and answer that question. And we said, well, that in itself can be quite disengaging, because people invariably say, we don't even know what the problem is. So inviting us to come up with answers, well, you've already framed it. You've built the sandpit. You've decided who should play and what the games are going to be and what the puzzle is we're trying to solve. And we're invited into your sandpit. And we thought, no, let's do it that citizens actually design the process. They decide what the questions are, and they did that. So in one day, we had 400 people who come up with the questions that were to be answered by Queenslanders, and they did a really brilliant job of doing that. And they voted on the best questions in different categories. They were sort of then framed in a manner that was sort of, fairly consistent. They were wordsmithed by a team of people who were there on the day. And then we also said, how do we get people interested in talking about these questions? And government was limited with its resources, and the people who'd been involved in framing the question said, well, we can help you with that. Why don't you give us information packs? Why don't you give us some slide decks? And let's use our networks, and government could promote the process as well. And we invited anybody anywhere in the state to host their own engagement, to have a barbecue, which is a very Australian thing to do, or host a dinner party, or go to a parents and citizens event. And wherever you're meeting, whoever you're meeting with, have a conversation, pick any or all of the questions that were framed, and drop your answers into an online location. And we were hoping that we would get 20,000 or so responses across the state of Queensland. We thought that would be a reasonable level of participation, and we managed to get 80,000 contributions. So it went off. And I think here's another lesson. We thought it's amazing when people actually have some involvement in designing the process, that they're able to get a lot more traction. And there's a sense of government's not just doing this thing to us or for us. We're actually doing it, and we're helping government by working with government by co-designing the process and coming up with, in the end, what some of the answers might be. So we had the McCoy Summit. There were actually 400 people there. You see someone putting a question up, on the wall, and then later on people came around and were putting sticky dots on questions. And very powerful thing, we had the Premier there, not shown in the photo, but next to a school kid. And when we interviewed that during the day, I interviewed this school kid and said, how's that for you? He said, look, this is really amazing. We're trying to work out what Queenslanders should be talking about. My sticky dot for what I thought was a good question was worth the same as the Premier for the state. We were next to each other. We had the same number of dots. And that was kind of a really powerful moment for everyone who was there, but also just for saying, well, we're in this together. This is not a government plan for the people of Queensland. This is a plan that all of us are trying to develop, because we're all in it together. We need to figure this stuff out. And what was interesting about that process, when we sort of come up to then look at making sense of all the contributions, and there's a lot of work from very skillful and committed social research people who created themes out of potential answers to questions, and then they were prioritized, deliberated over by a group of 700 people, which came up with some key directions in a number of areas. And government, in this case, legislated the Queensland Plan. What they said is, this is the reference point. So all planning that's done by government departments and by local governments has to reference the Queensland Plan to see to what extent does this align with things that were talked about, deliberated over. And so that's how it was kind of enshrined. So it was a very interesting process to, which has has an ongoing life. So it's 5 years down the track. The Queensland Plan is still there for people to look at, and there's still a requirement for departments and local government to say, when we're doing our planning, how does this fit with the Queensland Plan? And of course, that will be reviewed, in 5-year periods and updated. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And I think another thing that was kind of challenging about it is that it was really sponsored by, the conservative side of politics, that it wasn't seen as being owned or pushed by, if you like, politicians who we might say are more, liberals or progressive or any of those sort of labels. It was actually a conservative government, and they just said, well, we want this to be a plan that Queenslanders put together, and we need to be responsive to that. So it was kind of really interesting. There are also some quotes there you'll see about what Queenslanders said about the process. And there's some really lovely quotes there from people who would otherwise probably be quite disengaged and skeptical about the process.
Wow, that's such an inspiring story.
It was amazing. It was such a privilege to be part of it. And it's funny how these things come about, that it was the politician who had carriage of it. So the Premier was all for it, but he asked his Minister for Environment to be the one to be the sponsor of the process. And years before, he worked for an NGO, non-government organisation, and he just came to a training course that I ran for, I don't know, 20 or so people. I think it was an IAP2 training course. And he turned up and he said, well, when he was given that job, he said, oh, I think I'll get Max and one of his colleagues to help us with this. And so it's just funny how from something so simple just sort of ended up being kind of this incredible opportunity to do this work. So that was interesting. But I better keep moving through other examples. Now we have another one here, which is enhancing our Dandenong Creek program. And this was a much smaller scale project, but this is one where we had a community that was very concerned about some environmental issues. And they had concerns about what they saw was sewage overflows in periods of flooding, and some of the impact it was having on the creek, which was a kind of a fairly valued creek in terms of biodiversity and just the amenity the creek provided. And the authority here, Melbourne Water, was very concerned that compared to other issues, it wasn't actually as bad as many other areas and things that they were fixing up, but the community was certainly activated. So this was driven by the community, not by Melbourne Water. But Melbourne Water then responded and said, well, there's a lot of energy and concern here, but let's actually invite people to have a look at what's happening in the creek and some of the things that are impacting on some of the environmental issues. And let's look at what could be done with a certain amount of money that they felt that they were able to put toward it, and invite people to come and look at what were the priorities and what would be the best way to address things. And not only that, but also to be aware of their criteria for deciding what projects should actually get attention first across their whole level of responsibility. So I guess it was saying, even though we're engaging a local community, we want them to think about there are many other communities affected by environmental issues that require action, and understand the criteria, but also let's look at the amount of money that Melbourne Water felt that they could contribute to actually help address some issues, and let's look at the options and alternatives. So there's a video, I believe, that we can show, which only goes for 2 minutes. It might give a bit of a feel for how that process played out.
We felt it was really appropriate to actually talk to the community about what we're deciding to do in their local area before we went forward.
I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with, and also what you all collectively learn and what you collectively bring to the process.
It's actually really interesting to see who we've got in the room. We've got participants that have lived in the area within about a 10-kilometre radius or so. We've got ex-Melbourne Water employees, people we've seen and worked with council. So this panel is the first part of the process for engagement. So we'll take on board the ideas and the values and the thoughts that come out of today's session, and then we'll use that with a stakeholder group to actually confirm what options are going forward.
I think engaging with the community is actually upskilling the community, so I really value that.
We said as a pollution measure there should be in-stream water flow mitigation and widening of the creek. The rationale for that is it improves water quality at the sites.
We slow the water down, we're more likely to create the biodiversity in the stream.
We need things like shelters, seating, and we should try and maintain the views of the Dandenong.
We also want to ensure that what is started in this process is sustained, that it's not just a 10-year project, but 20 years down the track, there are still things going on.
They worked together, I believe, to come up with some really wise recommendations.
It's been amazing. It's been such a valuable experience.
I think because the process was so thorough, we were able to work through the issues in a way that meant that we all understood what we were doing.
I really think community involvement is such an important thing environmentally.
I mean, it's just in some ways it's a very small project, but I think it's kind of interesting that the way we recruited people for that is we had half the people in the room were people who were already active, and some who I'd say were quite outraged about some of the issues. And then we supplemented that, and this is, I guess, where we're experimenting, is we then recruited half of the people from the community. We went through a firm that actually looked at who we needed to kind of balance it. So you'll notice in that yes, most people were from older age cohorts, but we were able to actually engage some younger people in the process as well. And we also got people who were not active at all. And so, I guess there's that kind of thing from the transition from caring about something and even being outraged in this community, but only still a relatively small proportion of people, to then work with fellow citizens and work with an organisation that's really open to saying, how do we fix this? And let's actually understand what's going on before we make some decisions and throw money at things. And so it was a very powerful process also for Melbourne Water to move from, we're nervous about engaging, we don't know what people are going to demand or expect of us, or how well they can understand some of the what's going on, to then seeing them as, we can actually work with these people and they're quite reasonable and they can learn some new stuff, but they can also bring information, and let's create a space where they can work together. And they did. And so as much as I advocate for it and I believe it, I still am really pleased about how people generally will exceed expectations when we create that kind of opportunity.
And I think that that is a beautiful segue, maybe, if we can, because I'm also watching some of the questions that are popping up
Okay, sure.
around, how do you kind of lay the groundwork that you need to do? What is some of the work to really assess readiness, to understand context, and to really plan well for large-scale community engagement? A couple of questions have come in around, when there's huge power differentials, when you've got huge diverse backgrounds in race or socioeconomic status or language, or, folks with lived experience of poverty, how do you create an equitable space where people can share their ideas and learn from each other, in your experience?
Oh, wow. See, that is such a big question, and I think we still are learning about that. What I found has been powerful is sometimes sharing some sort of illustration or talking about the system and how people have different touch points with the system and a different perspective, but it's not actually possible for all of us to comprehend or appreciate the system. And so the first step, I think, if we build relationships and people believe their perspective or their story matters, that's really important as a starting point. From there, I think there's the opportunity to say, wow, value your story. What are other stories that people have? And there might be different stories. So it's about inviting people to go on the journey, to be curious about other people's stories. And of course, organizations have their stories as well. And so them being willing to share their story, but to realize it's only one story. So I find that to be kind of whatever it takes to cultivate some curiosity is important. So if people are, say a newly arrived refugee will have a completely different experience, and they might think, well, I'm new in the country and my opinion probably doesn't count for very much yet. But if the message is, actually, we need some fresh eyes here, and you will see things that are really obvious to you that we're not seeing, and you're bringing your experience from another country, and that's valuable. So I guess it's that trying to, I suppose there's a bit of evangelism involved in this, and that is, we can only understand what's going on if we actually appreciate seeing something through a number of different lenses, and it's not to discount anyone's view. It's about actually trying to value a range of perspectives. So whatever that takes, and I don't know what that takes. Sometimes it takes breaking bread. It spent its time eating and going for walks together, and sort of creating an opportunity for people to appreciate each other's perspective and story. So whatever that takes. And I think in terms of readiness, I think people only get ready when they actually start doing the work. And I think there can be, so I think you start whenever you can start, and people may not feel like they're ready for it, but I think the readiness might mean, or the level of readiness is our effort or our involvement going to be worth it? And people don't know if it's going to be worth it. And organisations who are sponsoring the process may not be clear if they're ready or if the community is ready. But starting somewhere is saying, well, we are here where we are at now. What can we bring to the process? So I can't give you a very neat answer for that. But it's something, the Collaboration for Impact, which is an organisation in Australia that I'm an associate with, talks a lot about, we call it the readiness runway, about what it takes to actually move on the pathway of readiness. And I think one of the things that we've landed on is it really helps if there's a shared recognition that what we're currently doing isn't working all that well. Therefore, we need a different approach. And if there's enough people saying, yes, what we're doing now isn't working, so let's actually, and there's enough at stake, there's enough urgency that it's worth investing in giving it something a go. So for me, that's part of assessing readiness is, are we ready at least to acknowledge that what's currently happening isn't working too well, And often that's not that hard for people to say, yeah, obviously it's not working so well. So it's, and probably the conventional way that governments try to solve problems or organisations solve problems for communities also doesn't work. So therefore, we need a different way of trying to figure this out.
Which I think is the perfect segue to the last question that I think I'd like to ask you before we really do invite people to share other observations, questions, or comments for further conversation. And thank you, those of you that have been chiming in all the way along. It's been really helpful. The question I have is, what would you say are the main challenges that you encounter around meaningful citizen engagement and participation?
We can tackle this in a few different ways. I think for citizens and communities, the main challenge sometimes is being able to persuade people that this is worth the effort, and that that they have a level of agency, that they are actually capable of changing something. Because I believe there's a sense that communities and citizens have, is that basically they just have to put up with or deal with decisions made by organisations, by NGOs, services, government, and our job is to react to it if we're not happy. So one of the challenges is saying, well, actually, the reality is that none of us know the answers, and no organisation has. And if we did, we would have solved it by now. So basically, we need a different way of doing things, and we need your help. So if people are persuaded that there's a genuine invitation to say, and a genuine recognition that none of us have the answer to some of our most complex challenges, therefore we need your involvement, because it's not about what government can do or an organisation can do to solve a problem. It's about how we all have a role to play in that. Citizens have a role, community organisations have a role, governments have a role, different levels of government. So this is the issue. What are we going to do about it? And what role can each of us play in being part of the solution? So I think it's about, the main challenge is turning that narrative around from this is awful and this is what you should do to fix it, to this is awful and none of us know how to fix it terribly well. So we need to actually step into this space to figure it out. So that's one
putting
challenge.
Putting the issue in the center as opposed to my organization's role.
Yes, or putting
the issue.
Yeah, or putting any particular solution that someone's advocating for in the center. So sometimes it's saying, well, that's an interesting idea, interesting solution that you're putting forward there. What is the question we're trying to answer here? So let's step back. Are we asking the right question? And as you would be aware that when we're dealing with complexity, sometimes you don't know what problem you're trying to solve until you start trying to solve it. And then you realize it's trickier than you think. And so it's about, let's try and land on the question or the dilemma that we're trying to address here, and have a really good, solid, shared understanding of what that is. And that understanding will evolve as we're working together. But at least if there's an understanding that we'll have a role to play in trying to fix this or to work with this or work through it, then that's a great start, I believe. And I believe it's a very similar challenge with organisations too. Now, I guess what I'm talking about here are complex issues, problems we're trying to manage, and not all issues are complex. But generally, we're not too bad at tackling those. So I'm talking, I guess, here about complex issues and challenges. So the other challenge, I guess, is about how we work with organisations to shift their internal narrative about, well, if only the rest of the world would just cooperate with us, we'd be able to solve this. And so it's that sense of their ability to offer what they know and share that, but also to be open to how engaging different parts of the system to help work through something is a challenge when they believe their job are, they're the experts or they're the guardians and they're meant to know what the answer is, and that's why they're funded. Therefore, to shift from we are meant to have the answers, so let's pretend we have the answers, and hopefully we can market that to our communities, to shift from that to a place of recognition that we can't ever really address these really tricky things alone. We need to actually figure it out together. And that might mean that we need to do some things differently. It might mean that we need to stop doing things we're currently doing. And it might mean that we need to use power in a different way. And that is, we might need to share it. We might need to be open to other people directing us as to the best way to resolve this. And that is a challenge when people believe their whole identity is about being the expert and that we should have the answer. So acknowledging that we may not be able to solve it and we can't.
That's a big step.
It's a big one. It's not just challenging an organisation mentality, it's actually challenging the identity that people have. So it means if I actually acknowledge that, I'm giving up kind of my expert status and my whole reason for being often, or how I think of myself, or how I find my life is meaningful. I'm this expert, and so it's very challenging to let go of that. But I guess one of the things we try to do, working with people with that kind of outlook or that kind of challenge, is if you can actually work with other people in resolving this, you're going to become more of an expert. You're going to be an expert in actually tapping into collective wisdom. And that doesn't mean that your wisdom or knowledge doesn't count. That's part of the mix, but we're all getting smarter. And I know it sounds a bit, maybe it sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish, I don't know. But I actually think that it's, the reframe is that we're actually inviting people to develop a new kind of expertise, which is the expertise of tapping into the wisdom of lots of perspectives and to shift the system to move in a different direction.
Beautiful. Well, while we're waiting for folks to chime in with new questions, I'm going to take us all the way back to the beginning when Patricia shared for us a question really about, are there effective ways for engaging people in this changing landscape where everyone seems to be busy, time is limited, we're always having to make choices and we're stressed. It's that, that day-to-day pressure, and how do we break through that and encourage people to participate?
I have to acknowledge that, that's most of our lives are like that. So we have limited discretionary time to put to things. So you're likely to, people will commit time to things that they believe are important and are worth the effort. So that's the first thing we need to actually ensure and create the expectation that this is going to change stuff, and there's willingness and there's receptiveness to that. So that was kind of what I was talking about before with organisations. So that's one thing, but here are some really practical things to consider. One is that if you want to get a different lot of people involved in it, you might need to pay for their involvement. You might need to actually offer an incentive for people to be able to come to something, which means that they can arrange for their kids to be looked after, or that will help them to give up half a day of their work so that they can participate in something. And that's not always easy to arrange, but it might be necessary in order to start getting different people to the table. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is that I also believe that some of the groups that are often underrepresented in processes are people who are working full time and they're just really busy people. And so I think we're also looking at ways that we can use technology and digital engagement strategies. And to date, a lot of digital engagement has been people just going on, it might be on a Facebook page and it's a splat, it's a one line, it's a complaint, it's a statement, it's an accusation, it's and I'm not saying that doesn't serve some purpose, but I think what we're starting to explore now more is using online engagement in more of a deliberative way and looking at different ways of doing that. So there's a platform called Synthetron, which means that people are actually put into groups and they can have a conversation through a structured conversation with a library of information that the people are encouraged to read and look at, and then to see what ideas emerge, and those ideas are then voted on by a range of people. So it's not the same as
like a poll.
We have, it's like a poll. But
not
sort of
because it's deeper.
Yeah, deeper in that it's inviting people to listen, to learn, to think, to read, but we're looking for an hour of people's time to engage in that. And then that might become another input to the process, not necessarily the landing on what the answer is, but it's an attempt to have people thinking and raise the level of dialogue about something. So I think that there are ways we can use technology, and there's interesting different platforms being created around that. And I totally get that not everyone wants to engage in that way, but I think this is there are ways of engaging people who are often underrepresented, and they're busy people who are quite comfortable and computer literate, who might welcome the opportunity to participate in something in a thoughtful way for, in using digital engagement platforms. So I think that's something.
Share a link with us, Max.
Yeah,
to that
yes, I will.
that digital platform in particular.
Oh, sure, I can, and
I'm
there's
seeing one
some that I work
other
with
question.
in Australia. Yep.
One other question here around, again, Patricia was saying, what is effective engagement when there isn't a controversy? Is it only the enraged that can be effectively engaged? And I think for me, reflecting on your presentation, when you shared the Queensland story, involvement and or a focus on an aspiration or a hoped for future can also, I saw very clearly, be a beautiful catalyst for engaging people that isn't necessarily rooted in controversy, for sure.
Yeah, I think so, and I think some of the processes I'm talking about offer a different way to engage and to engage different kinds of people. And I would say that more conventional engagement processes reward outrage, that those who are outraged are the ones who have the majority of the platform and have most of the influence on the narrative of a process. And I think, and that's not to demonize people who are passionate and who are outraged. We need those voices, but we need to move from that to another place of being. And also, there are people who aren't engaged at all. And the link that we've got there, I know we didn't talk about it, with young people who often are not outraged. But to say, well, they may not be outraged, but they probably should be about some things, and we actually need them to get more interested in something. And so sometimes it's the process of saying, let's look at some of these challenges and what's at stake here, and we really need your help. So I think, and it's interesting, that invitation, people I find will step into that if they believe that invitation is genuine. It's easier to engage people if there's energy in the community, but you don't only want to deal with those who are already energized, because that's only part of the system.
That's a good piece of wisdom, I think, for us to end on. I can hardly believe our time is almost up. Thank you, Max, so much for this webinar, for sharing your wisdom. I can't wait to go on a cross-Canada road tour with you and learn more about your approaches and explore some of the neat ideas and initiatives that we know are happening out there already in terms of engaging diverse voices. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Duncan, if you wouldn't mind to just wrap us up.
Thanks, Silvia, and thanks, Max, for sharing with us. Like Silvia mentioned, I have a few quick announcements, but I think you're really going to appreciate some of these learning opportunities that we have coming up for you. As we've mentioned, the Tamarack Learning Centre is planning a trip to 5 cities across Canada, and we've invited along our friends and today's webinar speaker, Max Hardy, to help you bring new and innovative tools and methods for meaningfully engaging communities and citizens and bringing that wisdom back to your organization. So just a few quick highlights of the sorts of things you'll learn at this workshop. You'll be learning how to establish a common agenda differently, learning how to apply the lens of appreciative inquiry, design and facilitate citizen juries, and how to cultivate citizen leadership. So take a look at those dates for our Citizens at the Center Community Engagement Thought Leader Series, and you can follow the link on the screen for more information. As well, we have another event coming up, Asset-Based Community Development, Healthy Neighborhoods, Healthy Cities. This workshop will gather together over 250 community and neighborhood development practitioners to explore the use of asset-based community development and explore leading neighborhood revitalization techniques. We've brought together 7 of the world's top authors and practitioners in the field who will offer the opportunity for learners to earn a masterclass certificate in either asset-based community development or neighborhood revitalization. As well, in about a day, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, as well as a copy of the slides, a collection of links, including that digital platform that Max mentioned at the end there. As well, if you want to learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. We also encourage you to take a minute to complete a short webinar survey to offer feedback on how you enjoyed today's call. The link will be on your screen and will be sent out to your email as well. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks to Silvia and Max for sharing with us. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.